Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we look at culture and politics through a psychological lens. And oh, how many things we have to look at through that lens this week. One thing I'd like you to keep in mind throughout this episode is the concept of flying monkeys, or flying monkeyism. Flying monkeys is a term that people use to talk about the people who surround a manipulative or narcissistic person and do their bidding for them. And it comes from where you suspect it comes from. It's from The Wizard of Oz, the famous 1939 children's film. The Wicked Witch of the West had an army of literal flying monkeys, winged monkeys, that she sent out from the castle to bedevil Dorothy and the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, and Toto. Fly, my pretties! Flying monkeyism is a necessary component of effective narcissistic abuse, and you can think of narcissistic abuse as just a different term for what you might prefer to call cult rules and cult behavior. And I mean that broadly. I don't just mean a cult that we all, quote, officially recognize as being a cult. I do mean things that are mainstream too. The woke left right now is largely a cult. Critical race theory support operates as a cult. And I'm going to start out with an example of that from Fairfax County, Virginia. This is a short video from a protest before the Fairfax County Public Schools board. And apparently, there were people showing up for the school board meeting who were opposed to the insertion of critical race theory into the public school curriculum. Critical race theory, of course, being the framework that people use to analyze race relations, people on the woke left. And critical race theory supposes that there is a state of being called whiteness, which is essentially and inherently evil, essentially and inherently thinks of itself as superior to black people or people who are not white. And the adherents of critical race theory support this like a cult. And this that we're about to take a listen to is apparently the leader of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Let me give a quick aside here. That is what NAACP stands for. But of course, nobody speaks it out loud today because it has the phrase colored people in it, which is bigoted and racist. But people of color is not bigoted and racist. That's clear, right? There's nothing wrong with that, is there? So this is a woman apparently named Michelle Leet, who is leader of the Fairfax NAACP. Let's take a listen.
So let's meet and remain steadfast in speaking truth, tearing down double standards, and refuting double talk. Let's not allow any double downing on lies. Let's prepare our children for a world they deserve. Let's deny this off-key band of people that are anti-education, anti-teacher, anti-equity, anti-history, anti-racial reckoning, anti-opportunities, anti-help people, anti-diversity, anti-platform, anti-science, anti-change agent, anti-social justice, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-children, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-environment, anti-emissions policy change, anti-inclusion, anti-live and let live people. Let them die. Don't let these uncomfortable people deter us from our bold march forward. Thank you.
Wow. So let's examine a few of the things that she said. And if you're just listening, this took place outside, and this woman, Michelle Leet, is standing in the middle of a circle of people, overwhelmingly white. She is black. And the things she says, she gets away with because she's black. She's allowed to say these things that if we heard them from someone who was not black, we would immediately recognize them for the bigotry that they actually represent. But we are living in an era where we have sacred castes, sacred people. Black people, people of color, anyone who's non-white. No, I don't know what the definition is. It seems to change all the time. Trans people, queer people. These are sacred castes. And when you are a member of a sacred caste, everything you say is righteous. Everything you say is truthful. Everything you say is speaking back to power. Everything you say is getting yours back and righting the scales of justice. There's nothing you can say in a woke vein that you can't get away with. It's dangerous. So she's whipping this crowd up, and she's calling the people who are protesting against including critical race theory anti-history, anti-equality, anti-teacher, anti-change agent. She went on and on and on. And then what did she say? Let them die. Let them die. And what happened? You heard it. You heard the cheering, the whooping, the righteous hollering. This woman is animated by a spirit, but it's not the spirit of Jesus. Okay? It's not. These people around her are flying monkeys. You don't have to be personality disordered to be a flying monkey. Some people who are flying monkeys are personality disordered, but it can happen to almost anyone. It's happened to me. I've been a flying monkey. When you are convinced that a person you support or an issue you support is righteous, that any complaints they make are valid, and that any hardships or any obstacles in their way to getting a goal accomplished are put there by an oppressive outside force, you become a flying monkey for this person. It's cult-like, and you do their bidding. And let me tell you a quick example. Let me give you an example of how I was a flying monkey for my mother. In our household, there are some things I've told you a lot about my past and a lot about my upbringing. And I tell you that because I use it as an illustration of the dynamics that I believe are going on in our broader culture today, as in the home, in society, is my working thesis. And in our home, there were three of us kids, me, my brother, and my sister. There's a lot I actually haven't told you. If you think I overshare, and I do, there's a lot I haven't told you because it's not my story to tell. It might be my sister's story to tell. It might be my brother's story to tell. And if they ever want to tell that story, they're welcome to come on the show and talk about it with me. But there was a lot more that went on in my childhood home than just what I've shared with you on this show, and I wasn't involved in all of it. But the dynamic for a long time in my home was another similar dynamic that you see in a lot of cluster B homes. In some ways, I was the golden child, what they call the golden child. And my sister was the scapegoat child. Everything that was wrong was my sister's fault, but I was the golden boy. Obviously, that did not protect me from abuse. It doesn't mean that my mother was better to me. She was different to me than she was to my sister. And I became more of the golden child, actually, after I left the home. I'm a little bit older than my sister. And I think it was easier for my mother to stop venting the majority of her rage and frustration on me because I was a grown man, but my sister was a little bit younger. So I have functioned as a flying monkey for a long time. My mother had me convinced that my sister was the one who had mental problems. I've shared with you before that my mother actually, she didn't just institutionalize me, she institutionalized my sister. My sister was committed to a psychiatric hospital as a teenager and given what I believe to be a false diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Yes, it is in fact a wicked irony. My mother was the borderline, not my sister. Well, when my sister got pregnant, young. It was a big surprise, and it threw my mother for a loop. And my mother was worried about whether my sister was going to be able to care for the child, and said that she was worried that she was going to have to step in and take care of this child for my sister. I learned later that my mother wasn't actually worried about that. This is what she hoped would happen, and that is what she engineered to happen. She ended up getting custody of my sister's child. But when my sister got pregnant, I was in the caretaker role with my mother, and I was angry at my sister. How irresponsible you are. I'm ashamed to say that I had very little sympathy and empathy for my sister. I did not know the whole story. I did not know her circumstances. All I knew was that I had to do my mother's bidding. My mother knew what was best. And I met up with my sister. This has to be 25 years ago at this point. And I started yelling at her and calling her irresponsible and selfish. And look what she was doing to the family. Look what she was doing to mother. She was going to saddle our mother with yet another generation of child rearing, and that she needed to get her shit together. I treated her very badly. We've already had this conversation privately. My sister and I have a great relationship. She's over it. I'm over it. But it was bad behavior, and it was flying monkey behavior. I was convinced that everybody but my mother was the problem. And why was I convinced of that? Because I felt I needed to avoid the truth. I wasn't articulating this explicitly in my head as it was happening. My own motivations were much more opaque to me than they are now. But if I opened my eyes to seeing the complex nature of this situation, and if I made room in my mind and in my heart for my sister not to be the villain, and my mother to possibly be engaging in some bad behavior, that would have forced me to confront a much, much bigger reality. And that's a reality that I have confronted, and a lot of you know the story about that. But that's what I was fighting against, and that's why I was a flying monkey. So I want you to keep that dynamic in mind as we go through the rest of the show. And now we will turn away from critical race theory and back to one of our other obsessions du jour, the COVID pandemic. Now, from the White House, let's take a listen to what White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki has to say.
So a couple of the steps that we have, that could be constructive for the public health of the country are providing for Facebook or other platforms to measure and publicly share the impact of misinformation on their platform and the audience it's reaching. Also with the public, with all of you, to create robust enforcement strategies that bridge their properties and provide transparency about rules. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others for providing misinformation out there. Taking faster action against harmful posts.
Notice a couple of things. My view of this: she knows she's on ethically shaky grounds. That's why she's so inarticulate. Provide misinformation. She knows she's talking bullshit. If you're banned from one platform, you should be banned from all of them. This is the White House talking about working with Facebook, the largest social media company on the planet, with billions, with a B, billions of users, many of whom are on there for their livelihood and their job. The White House is working with Facebook to identify members of Facebook who are posting misinformation, and I think we are to deduce that they are making suggestions to Facebook about which individual citizens should be banned from Facebook. And I wonder which other platforms they're talking about. Are they suggesting that if you're banned on Twitter, that Facebook should ban you too? When the hell did the executive branch of the United States government get the right, the legal, constitutional, or moral right, to be talking to social media companies and pressuring them into, I mean, this is, if we were talking about this in an antitrust situation, this would be monopolistic behavior, coordinated behavior. Oh, well, they're banned over here. Let's ban them here too. This should really, really frighten people. And it seems to me that for at least half the country, it does not frighten them. It makes them feel good. The flying monkeys are all around. The amount of people I see defending this just astonishes me. The thing about it, when you are a flying monkey, you're a cult member and you think you're on the side of good and you think that you're in with Flynn. What you don't realize is that the same tools that you are using against other people on behalf of a more powerful force, those can and will be used against you. So even leave aside the ethical calculations. I think there's something actually unethical, actually immoral about supporting a government effort to get private social media companies to coordinate with each other to silence citizens. I think that's fundamentally immoral, and that ought to be enough to convince people not to cooperate with it. But because people don't always follow their moral intuitions and they don't always act ethically, let's just look at it from a pure self-interested standpoint. Even if you don't morally care about the rectitude of your actions, just out of pure self-preservation, understand that every tool you push a little further is going to be used on you. Yes, it is. Yeah, I know. You don't think it is, because you're always going to be the good boy, aren't you? You're always going to be the golden child. No, you're not. When you put a foot wrong, when you say the wrong word, or sometimes if you don't signal enthusiastically enough, just your lack of enthusiasm is enough to move you out of the golden boy category and into the scapegoat category. And we're going to move on to something else, but I do want to point out some of the filler words, these words, okay? I think of these as NPR words: robust, provide, harmful, impact, blah, 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 corporate, blah, blah, best in class, world-class solution, blah, 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 blah. Shut up. Shut up. If I never hear these words again. But these are the words that people use when they know they're talking bullshit. They don't say anything. They just sound best in class. Yeah. Well, we've had the White House spokeswoman, so let's have the president himself. Take a listen to what Joe Biden said in answer to a reporter's question.
Opposing misinformation. What's your message to platforms like Facebook?
They're killing people. I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
The reporter's question was, what is your response to Facebook? And Biden says they're killing people. They're killing people. Who, Joe? Facebook? Facebook members? The only pandemic we have is among unvaccinated people. No, it isn't. Because the news this week has been full of breakthrough cases of COVID infections for people who are vaccinated. This guy is folks, this is serious shit here, okay? This is serious shit. All the people who were upset at the outrageous and uncouth and vulgar things that Donald Trump said, and a lot of them were outrageous, vulgar, and uncouth, but he didn't say anything like this. They're killing people. People who post misinformation are killing people. The misinformation is actually people trying to have a reasonable, logical, and sometimes scientific discussion about treatment protocols, whether the vaccine is safe, whether drugs like ivermectin are effective in combating COVID, whether drugs like hydroxychloroquine are effective in combating COVID. This isn't normal. This kind of Stasi approach to shutting people up and labeling them as giving misinformation is not normal. This didn't exist in the United States before the past year and a half. We were building up to it, yes. But please hear how abnormal this is. And I don't know where we're supposed to turn. It sure as shit isn't the Republican Party, because I saw a tweet from my friend Mike Harlow this week. We'll put it up on the screen. From the New York Post, quoting Mitch McConnell. He says, well, this is the New York Post, I think, paraphrasing him. Get vaxxed or get ready for lockdowns, McConnell warns. Quote, this is not complicated. Oh, tough talk there, Turtle Boy. They're part of the machine, too. The Republican Party is the machine. They're not going to save us. No one's going to save us. Only we can save ourselves. Nobody else is going to ride in on a horse and save us. We have to save ourselves. We have to speak up. We have to say no. We have to deprive people of our votes. We have to run for office. We have to protest. We have to stop patronizing businesses that comply with these draconian mandates. We have to do something because they're not going to help us. And one of the things about tough times, and these are tough times, is that tough times bring out wannabe heroes. They bring out people who have an egotistical interest in being perceived in public by you and everybody else as heroes. And some of the worst behavior in that vein has come from medical professionals over the past year and a half. I have always been skeptical of people who work in public health. I have always thought less of them than the average person on the street does. I do not give them the credit that I think more people do, because I don't believe them. I don't believe they do what they do, many of them, for the right reasons. I think they're egotistical. I think they are petty authoritarians. I think many of them would be career bureaucrats in some other field if they weren't in public health. But I have been watching public health wage publicity war against certain classes of people for a long time. They did it to smokers. Now they're doing it to the unvaccinated. This is not a surprise to me, this behavior that we're seeing. But what does bother me is how many of us cooperate with their efforts to be perceived as heroes. Newspapers and media are acting as publicity machines for these people as if they were Hollywood stars. So I saw this long, sentimental article in AL.com, an Alabama newspaper. I'm sorry. I should have written down the actual title of the newspaper, but it is AL.com. It's another bothersome thing. All these media companies back 20 years ago bought up domains like Syracuse.com, the newspapers did. And so we don't know if their name is the Syracuse Post-Standard or Syracuse. So anyway, AL.com features an interview with Dr. Brittany Kobia, who is described as a hospitalist in Birmingham, Alabama. The article is titled, "I'm Sorry, but It's Too Late." The introduction says, Dr. Brittany Kobia said Monday that all but one of her COVID patients in Alabama did not receive the vaccine. The vaccinated patient, she said, just needed a little oxygen and is expected to fully recover. Some of the others are dying. And I pulled a series of quotations. I'm not going to read you the narration that happens in the paper. You can fill it in for yourself. I just pulled Dr. Kobia's quotes herself. And I think we have her up on the screen here. And for those of you who are listening and not watching, big toothy smile, white doctor's coat, stethoscope around the neck, big toothy smile. Big wide-eyed toothy smile. I don't know. This one's sort of 6 of one, half dozen the other, but I don't read this as honest. And I might be biased. My mind might be polluted now because I've read her words, and I might be reading that into how I interpret the image. But this looks fake to me. It looks like somebody who wants you to think of her as a smiley person. She's not actually a smiley, kind person. Quote number 1 from Dr. Brittany Kobia. She's talking about speaking to patients who are dying of COVID who have regrets about not getting the vaccine. This is a morality play that she's doing. So she says, quote, "One of the last things they do before they're intubated is beg me for the vaccine. I hold their hand and tell them that I'm sorry, but it's too late." No, they don't. No, they don't. That's not true. Maybe 1 or 2 people occasionally who are in the dying stage of having a disease like COVID would ask for the vaccine, but most people aren't that unintelligent. They understand that vaccines can't retroactively retract a disease that they're already dying from. No, Dr. Kobia, they don't beg you for the vaccine. You're not telling the truth. You needed to say that so that you could say the second sentence, which is, I hold their hand and tell them that I'm sorry, but it's too late. Aren't you kind? Next quote. You know, so many people that did all the right things and yet still came in and were critically ill and died. The people who did the right things. And what are the right things? They wore masks. And they wore them happily, and they didn't say no. They didn't talk back. They wore masks. They got their vaccine. They did what they were supposed to. And they still got critically ill and died. They shouldn't have, because they did the right things. Oh, it gets more. It gets more like this. Next one. And then a few days later, when I call time of death, I hug their family members and I tell them the best way to honor their loved one is to go get vaccinated and encourage everyone they know to do the same. Good God, it's an infomercial. I hug their family members. Ugh. Don't touch me. Kiss of death, that one. And I tell them the best way to honor their loved one is to go get vaccinated and encourage everyone they know to do the same. Next one. And what do these family members of the dying people, how do they react? This is what Dr. Kobia says. They cry. And they tell me that they didn't know. They thought it was a hoax. They thought it was political. They thought because they had a certain blood type or a certain skin color, they wouldn't get sick. They thought it was just the flu. But they were wrong. And they wish they could go back, but they can't. So they thank me and then go get the vaccine. And I go back to my office, write their death note, and say a small prayer that this loss will save more lives. This is fucking disgusting. You know what it reminds me of? Think back a few episodes. Remember when we talked about Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, thanking George Floyd, the man who was killed by Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, thanking George Floyd for sacrificing his life for justice. These deaths, and I'm not even sure I believe Dr. Kobia's claims about the number of deaths. She may be right, but I'm not convinced. Provisionally, I don't know. This is just fodder for them. These people don't matter to them. The example that they can use to browbeat you and to self-aggrandize, that is what these people care about. She needed to tell that story so she could tell you that she went back into her office and said a prayer. That's why she said this. Next one. You kind of go into, this is where she starts to tell on herself. And I know this will be obvious to some people, but looking at the reaction to this article, and I've seen it featured on several social media spots, many, many people do not see through it. This pablum, it works. Quote, You kind of go into it thinking, okay, I'm not going to feel bad for this person because they make their own choice. But then you actually see them. You see them face to face, and it really changes your whole perspective, because they're still just a person that thinks that they made the best decision they could with the information they have and all the misinformation that's out there. Yeah. No. I don't kind of go into it thinking they made their own choice and I'm not going to feel bad for someone suffering. Brittany, you do that. Not me. You. Next one. And now all you really see is their fear and regret. She loves this. She loves this. And even though I may walk into the room thinking, okay, this is your fault. You did this to yourself. When I leave the room, I just see a person that's really suffering and that is so regretful for the choice that they made. You getting it yet? One more. It's really hard because all of us physicians and other medical staff, we've been doing this for a long time, and all of us are very, at this point, tired and emotionally drained and cynical, she said. Yeah, you're a fucking hero. You know what I think, Brittany? I think you're telling cock-a-doodie fibs, you dirty birdie. Annie Wilkes. This is not a kind woman. This is somebody who gets off on using other people's suffering so that she can get a hagiography written about her in a goddamn newspaper. Disgusting. We're coming up on a break here, but we have a treat in segment 2. We have an interview with Brian Edward from the nonprofit organization MythInformed. And MythInformed takes a look at politics and culture and tries to connect the narrative, myths, and mythology that inform that those parts of culture so that we can better understand why we make the decisions we do, and in their words, so that we can have better discourse. So, see you after the break. Thanks so much for listening. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us. We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you. Welcome back. We are joined today by Brian Edward of the nonprofit organization MythInformed, which looks at social and political issues through the lens of narrative myth. And the goal of the organization is to limit the effects of authoritarian ideology by promoting viewpoint diversity. And they do this through conferences and videos and other productions. Let's take a look at a teaser clip from one of their videos.
Who point out truth are considered extreme.
I can't believe they're taking my money and killing brown people overseas. That is an outrage.
I also think on the other flip end, extremity is not just the rhetoric that is seen as being normal, but also the fact that when we want to talk about the real problems in this country, the people who point out truth are considered extreme. It's like we always talk about, let's say we're in Kenosha here, let's talk about Jacob Blake. Well, it's like just this weekend, 24 people were shot, predominantly black men, by other black men, just an hour and a half down the road in Chicago. Nobody gives a damn. And yet they say that you're extreme if you say something like 13% of the population commits over 0.5% of the violent crime. Well, it's like, actually, that's not an extreme statement, because in fact, you're right, that is racist to say and blame black people for the violent crime. Because in reality, 13% of the population is not committing over half the violent crime. Most of the violent crime is committed by black men, which if we're just taking averages, let's say is about 6.5%. It's not being committed by children and often the elderly, it's a certain age group. So in fact, actually, almost half the violent crime is being committed by 3 to 4% of the population.
We are in a left-wing driven cultural inquisition right now. It's driven by critical race theory. It's driven by cancel culture. There is one side in this country that has cultural hegemony, and it ain't the conservatives, and it ain't the Christians, right? It is the left. It is the people that, you could say left, you can say liberal. I'm aware of the distinction. I do respect the distinction, but that is the side with the power, the influence in our institutions, in our government.
Excellent. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So that was, I'm guessing that was from your one of your recent conferences. Do you have one every year?
Yeah, we try to. Sometimes we push 2 a year. Sometimes they're 9 months apart. So we call it Better Discourse. And the point of this is to bring in partisans from opposite sides to talk in a civil manner, which we see a lot less of. I mean, you've mentioned a ton that our politics are so corrupted, and we accept a lot of your thesis in that it's being taught through a cluster B. We're modeling this cluster B. We see that, and what we want to try to bring is people. You can bring whatever viewpoint you want in, but you have to engage in a civil way. You have to talk to the other person. It really helps. It takes away a lot of the online cluster B stuff, I think, this online toxicity. But at the same time, there's a certain segment that won't come. Typically, we reach out to the left and to the right. The right's pretty easy to get. The left's a lot harder to get. We typically tend to get liberal lefts. Very, very hard to get progressive left people to come.
Okay, so when you say the words progressive and liberal, I think I understand this, but I want to make sure it's clear. You would put the progressives to the left of those that you are describing as liberal. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's the terminology gets difficult because it seems to me that regardless of how you describe people on the political side of the aisle on the left, trying to talk about, reasonable left-leaning politics versus the extremity of woke, there's always someone who says, no, don't use that name. That's not us. We're the good ones, or we're not the crazy ones. So I've never, I always want to make sure that definitions are quite clear. I'm not surprised to hear you say that it's more difficult to get progressives to participate in an event like this. I think a lot of us have found that that's the case when we're trying to get any such conversation going. You describe MythInformed as having as its thesis that our social and political landscape is informed by mythological or narratives of myth. Do you have a go-to example that you think is a really good contemporary demonstration of that?
I'd say the one you're hearing all the time. America is founded in 1619 when the first black slave is transported into Virginia. So that being the founding of the country, and the independence of the country is June 19th, 1865, when in Texas they announced the liberation of the slaves. So you have a new founding. So out is Jamestown in 1607 is the first successful English colony, and in is 1619. Instead of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence being, and the Revolutionary War being the Independence Day, now we have June 19th, 1865. And note that they call it that. It's called Juneteenth Independence Day.
Yeah, I noticed that this year. Juneteenth Independence Day. I wonder how long it's going to be until that's simply declared Independence Day, and the 4th of July is no longer called Independence Day.
I think that's absolutely the plan. That's the new founding. We're pushing this. You'll see that, like, another narrative myth is policing has its roots in the 1850s in runaway slave catchers. So that this is the root of policing, was people catching slaves. Again, another narrative myth. So
it's amazing how quickly those things catch on. I remember the first time I heard that, and I think, I'm sure the first time I heard that police come from slave catchers, and that's where police come from, so the entire institution of policing is corrupt. I heard that first when I was still on the progressive left. As you know, we talk on certain social media. I used to be woke myself. And I don't remember being shocked by that when I heard it. I'm not sure that I fully understood it or fully believed it or fully endorsed it, but I do remember thinking, oh, well, that's another way to look at this. And I look back on it now and my goodness.
Right. Now,
I was really brainwashed.
There's a tiny kernel of truth, but mostly this is fake. In 1850, they had the Compromise of 1850, right? This was an extremely unpopular way to try to avert the Civil War. So they make the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They say no slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line and popular sovereignty of slavery below. All of this is trying to avert the Civil War and keep this. But one of the pieces of that legislation that the South insisted on, that the North hated, was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And when that came in, so the Underground Railroad needed to be extended from, say, the Ohio River up north to Canada, because you weren't safe in Ohio anymore if you had escaped slavery into Ohio, which was a free state. You had to go to Canada because of this Fugitive Slave Law. The North hated this. They absolutely hated this, but they were compelled to create these people to try to catch them. Now, generally, this wasn't well enforced because who wants to do this? There was no support for this. So they did create some of these institutions to catch slaves in this way, but they weren't doing a lot of hard work. You know, imagine a person during Prohibition that's supposed to catch the liquor runners, but doesn't really care. And this, one of the big problems the South was saying, you're not enforcing this. You're not doing it. It was one of the reasons why they were pushing for secession. That's the kernel of truth they have. But I mean, why do they call it a paddy wagon, right? When you get thrown in there, because these were Irish miscreants in New York. They called it a paddy wagon because they were loaded with Irishmen, drunken Irishmen.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason for this. It doesn't fit. But
No, that's not true. Don't ever say that.
I know. And again, no stereotype is allowed anymore, except for stereotypes that they like. This is the new narrative.
Right.
It's okay.
Yes, they're all false. They have no kernels of truth in them at all, unless we like them.
Yeah.
And then they're good. Well, how long has MythInformed been around? Whose idea was it? Are you one of the founders? What prompted the creation of your organization and your approach?
Yeah. So Sean and Fritz are the founders of it. I came in a little bit later, but became like the third guy. So they initially were looking at narrative myths through a religious lens. So generally, they weren't focusing on politics. They were focusing on religions, because we saw a lot of religious strife. At the time, you were seeing the rise of radical Islam. I mean, we really saw that came into view in 2001 at the 9/11 attacks. But you saw this Islamism starting to really make a push in the 2000s and then the 2010s. So they were looking at this and looking at it through comparative religion, right? It really did take an atheist angle on it, because they were saying, what's real? What's true? Many of our religious stories are narrative myths. That doesn't mean that they're worthless, but many are myths. And how you interpret that is going to determine your worldview. So that's what they were looking at. When I joined, we got into that for a while, but this cultural milieu that we're in, we just kind of made the shift to look at this because it seems much more relevant than religion right now.
It's interesting because I know that in the 2000s, I think, around 2006, there was what was called the New Atheist Community took off, with a lot of attention being paid to Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith. I was a part of the New Atheist Community and hung around there for several years and went to conferences, and at that time was pretty firmly convinced that the biggest problem facing our body politic was a creeping religiosity, that it was religious believers who were mucking up our discourse and infecting the science curriculum in school. And actually, I mean, at that time, I think it was declining, but there were problems with groups that were trying to teach creationism in schools and to say that evolution can't be taught. Those things were actually happening. But, in my view, that community, the new atheist community, could not or did not want to adapt to a changing reality where secular religion, if you will, or what we might call wokeness, was having a greater impact on public discourse and on how we talk to each other. And I think that's still true. What do you think?
Yeah. So when did you get out of atheism? Can I ask? Like, when do you remember, like, kind of not being part of it? Or when's the last time you really engaged with it?
Probably around 2012 or so.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So, I don't really go in until 2014. To give you an idea, so Sean and I went to the Apostacon conference, and we drove 8 hours to Omaha. That was a blast.
The what conference?
Huh? You remember that?
The what conference?
The Apostacon. Get it?
Oh, is this like the flying spaghetti monster?
Yes, right. But it's also a play on apostate. So, is there such a thing as a triple entendre?
Yes.
So, anyways, there was a fun conference. Neil deGrasse Tyson was there. I got to meet all these people. Like, I used to listen to Aaron Ra all the time and just got to talk to them. And there was all these people. Everyone was nice. You could seemingly talk about everything. I mean, I talked a little bit about politics. We talked about all kinds of subjects there. It was wide open. And I thought, this is great. This is a place where I can talk about anything. And that was the point of it. But by 2016, we went to the second Reason rally, because the first one is 2012. And this stuff was already starting. And I remember when I went there, I talked more about politics than we did religion at the Reason rally. And I thought, okay, we've got to make a shift. And then we did. So for our MythCon 4, we invited Sargon of Akkad, Armored Skeptic, and Shoe on Head. And this was a taboo of a landmine that we had no idea that we were stepping on. And it created...
Let me just stop you for a moment. Just for people who don't know who those people are, those are sort of stage names. Could you say who they are again and what they do?
Yeah. So Armored Skeptic and Shoe on Head, they were dating at the time, or were both. Armored was an online atheist creator with a channel named Armored Skeptic, and Shoe on Head was more of she wasn't specifically atheist, but she kind of made SJW cringe videos and just really funny videos making fun of absurd political cultures. Sargon of Akkad, again, bigger YouTuber, partially in the
that's Carl Benjamin. His name is Carl Benjamin.
Yeah. Right. Sorry, and I kind of refer to them as when I initially heard them. So yeah, that's Gregory Fleur, June Lapine, and Carl Benjamin.
Okay. It's interesting that you say you got into that community around 2014 and then started getting out of it around 2016. Because it sounds like some of the great SJW schisms that had occurred there, you may have missed those, because I think that started happening around 2012, if my memory is correct, when the community turned to something they called Atheism Plus, which was the idea that it wasn't enough not to believe in God, it wasn't enough to advocate for a secular worldview, that you had to affirmatively embrace and further the political goals of social justice activism. I mean, in a way, it reminds me of Ibram X. Kendi, who says it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be an anti-racist.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah, we made that shift because it seemed that was the obvious like kind of elephant in the room. So we attacked it directly by inviting people on the left and the right, and the Carl Benjamin was supposed to speak to a guy named Thomas Smith at MythCon. This is in 2017. And we had set that as like the third talk of the day, with the top billing going to, it was more of an atheist talk about Islam, Azra Nomani versus Faisal al-Muhtar. But what got all of the outrage and all of the real coverage was the Sargon Smith, or rather Carl Benjamin Thomas Smith debate. And that's when the online mob came. That's when I realized some of the stuff that you were talking about, when your friend who was writing got viciously attacked. We got the Twitter mob descending on us, and it was a pretty big one.
What was the issue? What was the dust up over?
That we would deign it all to invite Carl and put him on a stage, even if he were talking to somebody of an opposite viewpoint, and that June and Greg also they were speaking together, so they were speaking, quote, unopposed, and that these people are Nazis, these people are alt-right, these people are racists, they're bigots, and how dare you bring them? In fact, there was an article that said anti-SJWs to gain strategic platform at MythCon. So they looked at this as, yes, that we're holding Little Round Top, and we've got to get it.
Unbelievable. Were there particular, I know I'm about to ask a question that asks you to tell me how any of this makes sense, which is probably a very silly question. But were there particular things that any of these speakers said, particular specific political issues or points of view that really exercised these people? What was the content of their objection, or how much of it might also be, I've noticed that people on the progressive left in social justice circles, sometimes it's not only that someone might hold a position that is out of step with SJW orthodoxy. They might be angry at you simply for being insufficiently enthusiastic about social justice policy. What was it that so exercised people?
Specifically, Sargon, they had listed a number of his sins. But absolutely, the number one sin was he was on Twitter. He's been banned now from Twitter at some point, 2016. He tweeted at Jess Phillips, who was an MP at the time. So remember, he's in England,
in the UK.
Yeah. So Jess Phillips is an MP, and Jess Phillips was talking about how the internet is not safe for women and girls, and that we need to censor this to make the internet more safe because of rape culture and misogyny and other things. And Sargon tweeted at him, he tweeted, now he was blocked by her, so he didn't at her, but he said, Jess Phillips, I wouldn't even rape you. And by saying that, now he has gotten all of the ire. Now, there were many other things, but by far that was the one that we heard the most often. Now I looked into this, and turns out the next day, so this goes viral, right? She's not added. Eventually she sees it as it goes viral. She goes on Victoria Live the next day and says, you know what? I don't care. I was with my kids. I don't, it doesn't even bug me. I don't care. And then later, months later, as this really picks up and swells to be a story, then she says how much of a victim she was. So at a first glance, no, I wasn't even offended, whatever, it's politics. And then now, no, this is very hurtful, and so on and so forth. So to me, I thought, okay, if anyone he owes an apology to, it's Jess Phillips. It's not me, and it's not the mob.
Speaking of, that brings up a thought I've been having about thinking about myth. Would you, well, I'll tell you what I think, and you can tell me whether you agree with this or see it differently. I think over the past 10 years that we've been watching the creation of new mythological narratives that take hold so quickly and become so widely believed in by people who are in progressive politics that we very quickly forget that they are new myths and they're not things that people believed just a few years ago. And I think, for example, the claim of rape culture might be one of those new myths that we've witnessed the birth of in the past 10 years. The idea that we live in a culture that positively sanctions, affirms, or endorses rape. Some of the claims include the idea that in Western countries, or like the UK or the US or Canada, I still see people say this frequently. Rape is de facto legal. So that's an example of I think, a new narrative. Are you seeing that too? Do you think that we are watching the birth of new narratives?
Yeah, you are. And one of them that I've seen, and this comes from a study that initially was done, I think, at Northeastern College, that 25% of women get raped when they go to college. 25%. Now
25%?
That's the number. This is higher than the Congo, right? This is terrible. If it was truly 25%, would children or would parents send their girls into that kind of a war zone? Absolutely not. This is a myth. Now, it's all based on self-report and what is rape. That any unwanted piece of affection might, in fact, be counted as rape. So this is how they inflate those statistics. But then what they'll do is they'll say, but rather than call it sexual assault, let's just call it all what it is. It's rape. So everything gets blasted to the very, very top.
Right, and that's the inflation. I often call it emotional inflation because it's meant to prick at our consciences, tug at our heartstrings, or invigorate us with fear and anger. I have a question for you. What would you say is one of the biggest myths that you at one time fell for? I have many. And I'll confess to all of them. But is there something you once believed in that you look back on and say, now, that's just a created narrative, but I fell for it?
I think it's possible that, are we talking about in the social justice world or politically or any of these?
But politically in this area, I don't necessarily mean a religious belief. I mean, something, any of the tenets, the received wisdom of the politics that we've been talking about over the past 10 or 15 years. Was there anything that you believed in that after examining it, you said, wow, that was misguided. It wasn't ever true.
Right. There was, there was one, but I guess, the biggest, the one that I would say that's probably it, that Trump is that Trump is really is the problem. He's the one that created this. If we had, our politics would be so much better if it weren't for Donald Trump. That it wasn't as bad. That he had a special kind of way of making it very worse. That I don't know what the exact myth is, but Trump himself is just completely toxic. That he's the problem. That it's all him. It's not around him. Does that make sense? I don't know if we can put it.
Yeah. Yes. No. I think that's a good example. I think one way to describe that myth concisely is to say that there was something about Trump that was singularly evil.
Yeah. That's fair. and for a while, I did believe that, and that
I did too.
I would even say, F him. I don't do that anymore. And that changed. I don't know when that changed, but after we got the online mob in 2017, a lot of things changed. So that was my wake up moment. I was never on the social justice left, but I was always critical of it. But man, when you saw the nastiness, there was that was an eye opener.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the false beliefs, or one of the myths that I fell for as well. And I know a lot of people who are like us in that way. I didn't like Trump. He brought a lot of problems. I think there were aspects of his personality. I do think he's incredibly narcissistic. But then again, I don't know very many national politicians that I wouldn't say that about. And it seems to me that it was easy to react to Trump's grandiosity because it was so blatant and it was so in your face. It was sort of like grandiosity classic, right? There wasn't anything subtle about it. Whereas there are a lot of politicians out there who are a lot more smooth or charming. They're able to keep their temper and their apparent ego in check more. But they are no less narcissistic, manipulative, and dishonest than any other politician. But because they are able to wear a suit, whether it's actually clothes itself or the demeanor that they put forward, they wear a suit of respectability. And they're able to get by, whereas somebody who's, well, as vulgar as Trump actually is, it's very easy to say, look at him, bad man, bad man.
Yeah. There was another one that I was going to mention at first. If we have to mention a social justice thing, and I don't know how deeply I imbibed it, but I do remember saying this at one point, that rape is about power, not sex. Right? That's when you hear a lot that this is, it's all motivated by power. And that's just not true. That it is, in fact, motivated by sex. Obviously, there's a power dynamic in that that there's part of it, but the motivation doesn't come from wanting to dominate women. It comes from sex.
I've thought about this a lot too, because that was also a belief that that I held for some time, and I understand where it comes from in feminist thinking and feminist politics, and I think it's motivated by the serious with which activists and women ask us to take the crime of rape. It is a very serious crime. It's a violation that has a quality to it that's unlike any other violation. And it is obviously a situation in which there's a huge power dynamic at play. But what I think that idea has missed might be a deeper, less palatable truth. I don't think it's that there's anything. Let me say it another way. I think people don't want to consider the possibility, the scary possibility, that for the kinds of people, the kinds of men who become rapists, it's not that it's not about sex, it's not about power. It's that for them, power is sexy, that power and sex are tied up with each other. And there are people, unfortunately, who, yes, very much do eroticize exercising that kind of power. That the sexual drive itself can be corrupted and informed by this lust for power. And I don't know if I'm entirely right about this, but I suspect that that's something that's a little bit unpalatable to people, and they don't want to consider it. They want to think that there's a bright line between the depravity of someone who's a rapist who's only in it for power, and then this beautiful and pristine thing over here called sex, which is never sullied by power considerations.
Now, the reason I bring it up is because this narrative gets in the way of, say, you often see this present in migrant rapes in Europe. They have a very, very difficult time talking about this because politically, a migrant coming in, walking in from Africa, coming across the Mediterranean and now into a camp and into the town has no political power at all. He has no money, he has nothing. And then when that person, in fact, rapes a local girl, they have a heck of a time talking about that because it doesn't fit the narrative power dynamic. In fact, one of them, as his defense in court, said that he had, quote, a sexual emergency. So this is off narrative, and that's what I'm saying. These narratives are clouding a deeper understanding. So I don't claim to understand it, but I know that it's not as simple as the narrative.
Right. You know, as we've gotten to know each other talking on social media, you've said to me several times that you see some of the things that I see. Of course, you know, anybody who listens to this show knows that the working thesis of this show is that our current political moment is being run along abuse dynamics, according to rules that are common to relationships where you've got somebody who is psychologically damaged in a way that we describe as having a cluster B personality disorder, narcissism, psychopathy, the instability of borderline personality disorder. That many people are familiar with, at least passingly familiar with, the kinds of relationship dynamics that come up when we're talking about an abusive marriage or an abusive home where the parents are abusive to the children. Fewer people understand that there's something called cluster B, a personality disorder that is very frequently behind these abusive dynamics. I'm wondering, I'm sort of trying to orient myself here. Before you and I started talking, did you all in MythInformed, did you notice these dynamics too? Whether or not you called them cluster B, whether or not you saw them through the lens of personality disorder stuff, have you all been having conversations about what is going on here psychologically that's different? Did anybody else make the connection that, you know, there's some parallels here to what we see in domestically abusive relationships? Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I think we noticed it. We didn't have the words for it. So but I would often get fooled by this. And when somebody was acting in a cluster B way, I thought that they were just extraordinarily passionate about this, that maybe there was something that I didn't fully understand, that that they were trying to present, and that maybe I hadn't done quite all the research, and that they had a very legitimate concern that I just didn't understand. Sean was a lot better at this. He just called them crazy, and would see it, right, and he would just make the judgment. And
yeah,
but no, through the cluster B, that's helped me a ton to know the difference and be able to point that out, because there are in fact partisans that are just heated. Those people will bring in and absolutely want those people to debate. But cluster Bs, no, you can't. They're just going to make a mockery of what you're trying to do.
That's a really good point. That you see them, and I think this is true for a lot of people. That we see people like this, and we make the default assumption, which is they must just be extraordinarily passionate about the topic. They would not be moved to act this way if they didn't truly care. And I think that comes from, that's the default assumption that we carry out into the world, right? It's a default assumption that other people are like me. Other people have emotions like I do. They have rational parts of themselves like I do. So if I were going to be acting this way, the only way I could imagine that I would be motivated to do that is if I really truly cared about that. And so in so doing, I think we do a form of projection. We often talk about people projecting their emotions onto others in a negative sense. So when somebody is accusing someone else of abusing them, when it's the person complaining themselves who's acting abusively, we often say, you're projecting your bad behavior onto other people. But I think we do a form of positive projection, which it can be just as dangerous, whereas we assume that because it would have to be genuine, passionate commitment that would motivate me to act this way, that must be why he's acting that way too, right?
Yeah, and then that gives them a patina of credibility that they don't even deserve. And then you're off looking and researching for that tiny bit of truth that maybe they're onto. No, that they've grabbed onto a narrative and they're in it for themselves. They may not care at all about that narrative, that they care about where that narrative gets them.
Yeah, and the phrase that keeps coming to mind, and I think this is a good one for anyone who's interested in this to keep in their mind and remind themselves, the issue is never the issue, right? And what that means, and I don't remember who coined it. I know that a psychologist and lawyer named Bill Eddy, who runs a really great organization called the and it just flew out of my head. I'll try to remember to put it in the show notes. The High Conflict Institute. They specialize in helping organizations and businesses deal with high conflict employees. And I know that Bill says this a lot. The issue is never the issue. Somebody claims to be, and I'm just going to pick something out of the air, an environmental activist who cares about planting as many trees as possible within a particular city park. That may be the issue that they claim that they care about, but it just happens to be one that has given them a means to get up onto a platform in a particular community and have pride of place, be seen as a community leader. But that if that didn't work anymore, they wouldn't give a shit about trees at all. They'd move on to something else. They'd move on to some other apparent do-gooding thing. So I think that for us to remember with these people, these kinds of people use issues, but they will change. They will do a 180. And it's not just changing your mind. I mean, people change their mind about politics all the time, but they'll drop an issue they were passionately committed to if it's no longer giving them that sort of narcissistic satisfaction. And I think we see a lot of that in the issues that MythInformed talks about and that this show talks about.
Yeah, and then you have the cluster Bs, and then you have the indoctrinated. So there's plenty of people that probably don't fit cluster B, but they repeat and model the same kind of behavior, and we see that just a ton. So most of our Twitter feed right now is documenting critical race theory and these kind of narratives in academia, in schools, everywhere, in therapy, in archaeology and engineering, and you're seeing it everywhere. I mean, a widget company can have this, and a humanities department can have this. And what we're trying to say is, here it is in its absolute wild form.
Yeah, and when you talk about the indoctrinated, I I often don't know if I'm more disturbed by the disordered and narcissistic people who are pulling the strings, or if I'm more disturbed by the fans, the hangers-on, and the apologists, I guess. Yeah. And that may be a little harsh, but people who you see these people, you see many of the same people that I take notice of in the news and on social media. We talk about this, that people have a very difficult time accepting the fact that somebody that they look up to, somebody that they think has leadership qualities or that really speaks out on an issue, might in fact be a manipulative person. And especially people who either have no direct experience that they know about in encountering these kinds of people in their personal relationships, or sometimes people who come from backgrounds of domestic abuse. I was one of these people. We can be fooled into being recruited as apologists for and supporters of these people. And I find it very frustrating sometimes to try to get people to see that, when I say your leader here doesn't appear to have completely transparent and honest motives, they're so resistant to that sometimes, you become the enemy to these people. And they're not disordered. They're not necessarily narcissists. Some of them might be. They're normal people. They're acolytes, or they've been recruited to be flying monkeys. And sometimes they put up a very good defense against seeing through somebody in a leadership position. Especially if it means something to them. So it sounds probably that I hate narratives and myths. I don't. They're necessary. But the ones that we have, I think, have been doing pretty well. I don't like these successor ideology myths at all. I think this is going to wreck things. But as you lose a religious narrative myth, as you lose the American ethos narrative myth, you might find yourself with a crisis of meaning. And that's where I think a lot of this is coming from. Explain to people what you mean when you use the term successor ideology. So successor ideology is maybe a better term than critical race theory, although critical race theory is a good term because it is something specific. You can look this up. Successor ideology is all the things in addition to critical race theory. So you have all sorts of critical theories. You have critical fat studies. You've got queer theory, right? There's critical everything. There's dietetics and there's critical dietetics. So all of these other ideologies wrapped into one are what I call, or what Wesley Yang calls, the successor ideology. And sometimes I use that term. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I agree. What would you say if you had to pick one or two compelling contemporary narratives or myths that you believe are going to cause us the most harm and that we should be most interested in getting on top of right now? What are they? I mean, certainly the founding of the United States in 1619. And in 2019, this was 400 years. So that you often will see in the narrative, 400 years of oppression. Well, why not 500? Why not? Well, the reason is the 1619 Project. They're undermining the ideals of the country. I mean, has America lived up to its ideals all the time? Of course it hasn't. Nobody completely can live up to their ideals. Like even religious people know this, that you could never be like Jesus. And in Islam, the sunnah, the idea of Muhammad is the perfect man, right? You know that you can't be perfect, but yet if America isn't perfect, like you can't tell its story, and that we need to rewrite it. I mean, if we lose that, the America rips apart. We need a narrative myth. Every country has this idea to tie that together. So that's the biggest one. Yep, and it is a big one. Listen, as we wrap this up, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a good conversation. I'm really glad that you and I have connected. I'm glad we met each other online, that we're aware of each other's works and the issues that we're both interested in. Where can people find MythInformed online if they want to learn more? So you can check out our Twitter feed at MythInformed. So yeah, like the word myth, the word informed, and then MKE. A lot of people think that's MythInformed Mike, but it's actually MKE is our airport code, right? But everyone's like, who's Mike? And we're like, we can't tell you. So we're creating myth, and we're creating Mike into its own narrative myth.
So you can check that. Better Discourse, if you look for that, that's our conference. We're going to have Better Discourse 3 coming up in November down in Dallas. So these are great. They're Fort Worth, Dallas, Fort Worth. These are great conferences. If you haven't been to them, it's a lot. We do it online, so you can watch online. But to be there, it's really a special event because there's a lot of energy, and you can actually talk to people on the other side. And there are kernels of truth to absolutely be found in legitimate partisan objectors, probably not in the cluster V folks. So we're doing our best to make sure that those things go, and they're a blast. So I'd say at MythInformed, MKE, and Twitter, and Better Discourse. If you have time to join us in November in Fort Worth, you should do it. It's a lot of fun.
Excellent. Brian, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing me on, Josh.
Make sure to subscribe to Disaffected on your favorite streaming audio platform so you can take us along for the ride. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and almost anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. Would you take just a minute right now and share our show on social media? On Disaffected, we take a close look every week at the abuse dynamics exploding in the dark and disordered world that we live in. Tell other people about us.
We now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us, and thank you.
I want to pick up on a couple of things I didn't have time for in the first segment. Distrust of how medical professionals see the public and treat the public. Right now, I have a couple of minor medical issues that I could use some doctor's help with, and I've been putting off going to the doctor because I don't want to have the vaccine lecture. And I know that I'm going to get it. I like my doctor. First of all, I need to say this. I like my general practitioner. He's been my GP for about 16 years. But the last couple of times I've had the vaccine lecture and I've put him off, and I've tried to be non-committal about it, say I'm still thinking about it. I know that it's going to come up again. And I don't know that I'm right about this, but my fear that's keeping me from going is I am worried that my care is going to be influenced by the medical team seeing me as a non-compliant patient. I might be wrong about that, but that is a thing that happens, okay? My doctor is not like Dr. Brittany here, okay? I don't think he's of the same character at all, but I do know how medical professionals can end up harboring prejudices about their patients and making moral judgments about the outcomes for their patients, and it worries me. I saw this close up when I had a heart attack at age 36. Obviously, it was a very big surprise. And it happened at about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I got men out there, if you're listening, pay attention to this, please. Men and women have different symptoms often for heart attacks. The classic heart attack symptoms that get described are actually more common to men. Women have a different presentation. But I had all of the classic male symptoms of a heart attack, and you should know what these are. It started out feeling like I had a bad case of indigestion behind my breastbone. And I've been prone to indigestion and heartburn all of my life. So at first I thought, oh, I must have forgotten to take my antacid medication. And I took my antacid medication and I took some baking soda and water, and it didn't get better. And it felt like a pressure behind my breastbone. At first, it was just pressure. It wasn't pain, it was pressure. But it was more pressure than I'd felt before, and it didn't feel right. And within about 10 minutes, I started to get, it started to become painful. It felt like if you've ever been outside in the winter, in the really cold air in the winter, and you breathe really deeply, you're exerting yourself from shoveling snow or doing winter sports or something like that. Not like I've ever done a winter sport. So I guess I don't know what I'm talking about. But it can feel almost like your lungs got burned a little bit because of all that cold air going in, but it was more than that. And then I started to get radiating pain down the left side of my jaw and down my chin, down my neck, on the left side of my body, and all the way down the left side of my arm. That's classic male heart attack symptoms. It's called referred pain. The problem is actually a completely blocked artery in the heart, but the nerves send pain down the left side of your body. If this happens to you, and I can't give you a description any better than what I've given, and the best I can say is I felt that something was wrong. I felt it intuitively. I felt it physically. It didn't feel like something I'd experienced before. If you get a feeling that a kind of pain or discomfort that you're having is capital W wrong, call an ambulance, because you may well be having a coronary. So I called an ambulance. Lucky I got to the hospital within about a half an hour, 20 minutes to a half an hour of symptoms setting in. And I didn't believe that anything was really wrong. They came and got me. They made me lay down on a stretcher, which I thought on a gurney, and they wheeled me into an ambulance. They wouldn't let me walk out of the house, which I thought was silly because I'm probably making this up. Maybe I'm just having a panic attack. They gave me a great big horse pill size aspirin and a Lipitor to chew on. And then they put me on oxygen. And it's only about a 7-minute ride to the hospital. By the time I got there, I was feeling a little better. I was lying on my back. And I figured I was just going to be in and out, and I will have wasted the rescue team's time. Well, they hooked me up to an EKG in the emergency room, and they're just talking to me, taking, my biographical details. And then the EKG machine started to give feedback and started printing out on a piece of paper what we were seeing on the screen. And Nurse Tracy ripped the sheet of paper out of the EKG, looked at it, and then she started running. And she ran out of the room. And then about 5 people ran into the room with a crash cart. And that's when I knew I was screwed. And they started ripping my clothes off. And the emergency room doctor came over and said, "You're having a major heart attack right now, and we need to get you into surgery." And it was horrifying. It was horrifying. I know I'm not the only person on earth to have a coronary. I know it's frightening for everybody, but it was particularly horrifying being that young. And as they were getting me ready to go into the cardiac catheterization lab, Nurse Tracy, I have some criticism for Nurse Tracy here, but it's not a global criticism because she did help save my life, and I appreciate her for doing that. I appreciate all of them. More than they'll know. I sent them a letter, but, they saved my life. But Nurse Tracy said, "Do you smoke?" She looks at me and she said, "Do you smoke?" And I'm thinking to myself, what in God's green earth does that have to do with the fact that I am having a heart attack right now? And no matter what got me to having a heart attack, it does not matter. And it completely distracted me. I had quit smoking 6 months prior. I had quit smoking with the exception of 1 cigarette a day. And this is the part where Nurse Tracy was getting at me. I'd moved over to vaporizing nicotine on a vape. And I'd already noticed a major improvement in my breathing. I didn't have a cough in the morning anymore. And I was still allowing myself 1 cigarette a day, that was the last time I had 1 cigarette a day. That ended my my tobacco use completely. And I was saying, yeah, but I have, and it's a yes or no question. Do you smoke? So she kind of verbally browbeat me. because she wanted me to admit to her that I smoked. This didn't have anything to do with the care they needed to give me at the moment. It does not matter that I smoked. It wouldn't have mattered if it were my weight. It wouldn't have mattered if it were my alcohol consumption. It was that too, I'm absolutely certain. I was having a heart attack there. And the reason I was having a heart attack didn't have anything to do with the mechanics of unclogging my right coronary artery. I never forgot that, obviously. It still bothers me today. Medical people are human. And I too, in my own sphere, although I'm not a medical person, I too get frustrated with people who end up in bad situations that I believe they brought on themselves. I understand that feeling. It's normal and natural and human. But you really have to take very great care when you're a medical professional not to allow that to influence your actions and how you view that patient. So anyway, that's the story of my heart attack and the story of my encounter with that sort of moralizing judgmentalism, even in extremis. I was at death's door, but it was important to this nurse to make me admit my sin in the emergency room, and I didn't appreciate it. Let's look at, we're still on COVID here. We're still on medical stuff. Let's take a look at a clip from an Australian newscast, because it's going to set me up for another topic that I want to talk to you about. Kevin, let's roll that, please.
Good evening. Within hours, Sydney will be in the grip of much tougher restrictions. The Premier clamping down on the stubborn Delta outbreak with what she's calling a no-regrets policy. And this is why. From a record 82,000 tests, the state today recorded 111 cases. And tragically, the third COVID death in this outbreak, a man aged in his 80s from the city's southeast. Across Greater Sydney, retail shops will now close. A small list of essential stores can remain open. Construction sites across the city shut down. And from midnight tonight, 110 suburbs across Liverpool, Fairfield and Canterbury Bankstown will be sealed shut. That's 900,000 residents who can't leave their area, even for work.
Okay. So, this is about a region of Australia. I'm not quite clear if it was an entire state or if it was just a city and its metropolitan region, going into complete lockdown with almost all businesses, including retail establishments, with the exception of whatever they deem to be essential, having to close, and 900,000 citizens unable legally to leave that region. She called it sealed. Why? Because they had 111 new COVID cases out of 900,000 people and one death. One death. 900,000 people are now back out of work. All these businesses are closed. And they've sealed the metropolitan region. You are legally not allowed to travel outside the border. We are not hurtling toward dystopia in the West. We are in dystopia. It's already here. It's not something to worry about. It's something you are experiencing right now. We're there. One death. And not just one death. One death of a man in his 80s. Notice what the newscaster said. And I'm not blaming her. I have a feeling the script was written for her. And even if she had input on it, I think she feels pressured into doing this. We all feel pressured into doing this. She described this as a tragic death. A man in his 80s. A tragic death. No. That's not a tragic death. The death of a child is tragic. The death of a young person is tragic. A death by murder is tragic. The death of an 82-year-old man is not a tragedy. Given, all other things being equal, making sure that it wasn't, a murder. Obviously, that would give a tragic quality to it. That man was older than the average life expectancy in the West for men. I think it's up around 78 years old. This is tied into flying monkeyism. This newscaster has been maneuvered into being a flying monkey for this larger project of scaring the shit out of everybody and justifying the overreach of bureaucrats and politicians who have seized control of our daily lives. Why do we feel obligated to describe the deaths of elderly people as tragic? And I tried to talk about this on Twitter because sometimes I don't learn my own lessons. And it went exactly as I expected it would go. Some people got it. Other people pretended that I was saying it's okay for your grandmother to die. No one is sad when old people die. Old people are expendable. They pretended that they thought I was saying that. No one believes that. No one believes that. So I'm sorry. I don't give such people the benefit of the doubt. I think they were actively engaged in pretense, and I think it's gross. I should not have to say, of course it's sad when your grandmother dies. I mean, for goodness sake. I have friends in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. I work with these people. These are people in my family. I love them. I will cry when they die. Of course. This isn't normal. It's not normal. But it's part of our new normal. And I don't just mean our new normal because of COVID. I mean, we have been moving in this direction, I would say, for probably the majority of the 20th century. I think it's been building at least that long. I think it has to do with what happened in the West in the 20th century. So in the 19th century and before that, some of us lived in cities, and almost all of us didn't live in cities before the Industrial Revolution, which was a bit earlier. But in the late 19th century, industrialization really took off, urban living really took off, and many more people were now living in cities and making their living outside of their home, whereas before, the farm was both your home and your work site. So births happened at home. Death happened at home. People in the United States don't know this, but before the late 19th century, almost every single one of us took care of our own dead at home. What we call a funeral home is an extraordinary modern luxury. The idea that you can call a commercial mortuary at 3 a.m. anywhere you live in the United States and have a corpse disappeared from your house so that you don't have to take any actual hands-on responsibility is brand new. This never existed in history before the past 150 years. Birth moved out of the home and into the hospital. Death moved out of the home and into the hospital. And our lives became much easier. Washing machines, automobiles, the telephone, vacuum cleaners. The amount of drudgery that we no longer have to do is astonishing. But there is a consequence to that, and the consequence is that we are disconnected from reality. And particularly in the United States, throughout the 20th century, as our lifespan got prolonged by modern medicine, we began to fixate more and more on youth. Plastic surgery came into vogue in the mid-20th century, first in Hollywood, and then it trickled down to the rest of us. The pursuit of youth. It has gotten to the point where Americans treat death as if it were an optional lifestyle choice that just might not be right for their family. Right? Oh, we consider death, but that's not right. That's not our family's lifestyle. That doesn't comport with it, so we're just not going to die. We talk about it as if it weren't an inevitability. Notice this. Keep your ear tuned for this. People speak about death in the subjunctive mood. They speak about it in the conditional. People say, oh, well, I was talking with my husband about planning for the future and our retirement and our estate. And then we thought, well, maybe we should be planning for a funeral because What if anything should ever happen to us? What if anything should ever happen to us? Anything is ever going to happen to us. You, viewer and listener, you are going to die. Guaranteed. I'm going to die. Everybody on this earth right now is going to die. But we act as if that's not real. And I think that is one of the major reasons why we have had a hysterical reaction to the COVID-19 virus. We are completely disconnected from the reality of death. And some of you might be objecting, and some people watching this maybe for the first time might think I'm off my nut. I'm not. You say, I can already hear you, those of you who want to criticize. I know I'm going to die. Everybody knows they're going to die. You're making this up. No, I'm not. You say that you know that, but your actions betray something else. That is why we speak in the conditional, why we use the subjunctive. That is why most of us don't plan for the end of life, either for our retirement, our estate, or our actual funeral. And we think if we just don't talk about it, and if we don't talk about it candidly, that it isn't going to happen. We act as if death... What is it that I'm reaching for here? We act as if death is an insult. It's an insult. If death comes to you, you are picked on unfairly by the Grim Reaper, because that's not supposed to happen to me. How else do we explain this? How else do we explain the bizarre, hysterical behavior that has characterized our public discourse for the past year and a half? When in history have adults and the old, not older people, you notice that too, right? No one's old. They're only old in comparison, so they're only older. No, some people are freaking ancient. We should all be so lucky to get old, right? Old people. When have we forced children to change their behavior to protect people who are at the natural end of their lifespan? No, I'm not saying we shouldn't take any precautions whatsoever, that we shouldn't shelter people in nursing homes. Of course we should. We should do things like Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, did not do to actually protect the vulnerable. But we've got teachers in this country who are still banging on and pressuring the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, through unions like the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, to require masking in schools for children. Why? It's not for the children. We talked about this on last week's show. The chances of a child under 18 dying of COVID are as close to zero as it is possible to get without being zero. You can say to a very close approximation, there is zero risk of your child dying from COVID. 1 or 2 have. Maybe a few hundred if you look at the broad population. I think the statistics I cited on the show last week, depending on the state, were either 0% of children died of COVID or 0.03%. Extraordinarily tiny number. And it's not even clear that children can transmit COVID to adults because they're not symptomatic. And everyone has forgotten this as well. There's no good evidence that there's a big problem with asymptomatic COVID transmission. This shouldn't be a shock, people. We all know what illness looks like. Most of us have seen actual influenza in ourselves or in our families. We've seen other contagious respiratory diseases. We know from long experience of being humans that the people who are most likely to transmit it are those who are visibly sick and coughing, and people in our households who are visibly and actively infected and sick, right? There's no good evidence that COVID is easy to transmit without that actual sickness. So the children aren't sick, they're not going to die from it, and they're not going to give it to their middle-aged teachers. So why are we doing this? Because we adults are babies. We are hysterical, selfish babies. We are willing to sacrifice our children. Yes, we are. We're doing it right now. We're willing to sacrifice their emotional development. We are willing to make them wear masks in public for no good reason. I still see parents doing it exclusively. I draw your attention, exclusively middle and upper middle class parents. I don't see working class people doing this. This is a middle class fetish. We are disconnected from death. That is why we are having this hysterical reaction. That is why we have newscasters who describe the death of an 80-year-old man as tragic. Nonsense. Okay, I've got one more thing for you before we close out the show. I had some other stuff planned, but I don't think we have time for all of it, and I want to get to what is interesting to me, and I hope it will be interesting to you. I'm going to talk about a post on Reddit, the forum, on their Off My Chest. It's called True/Off My Chest forum. Basically, it's a confessional forum. Now, I'm going to say this first. I do not know if this is in fact true. I can't know if this is true. I'm sure that many of the posts on this very popular forum are stories that people are making up for attention. This is what humans do. So I cannot tell you that I know this is true. It might be false. But I find it plausible. I think it may be true. And even if this particular rendition is not true, I am fairly well convinced that things like this are going on right now. This is ostensibly a post from a 13-year-old child who's being picked on at school because his mother has an OnlyFans account. And for those of you who don't know, OnlyFans is basically homemade porn that you sell by subscription. You take dirty pictures of yourself, or you take videos of you performing sexual acts for money for people who sign up there. It's digital prostitution. No, not sex work. Prostitution. We don't use those bullshit euphemisms here. Sex work is not work. It's not like working at McDonald's. It's exploitation. It's unhealthy exploitation. Period. End of story. Let me read it to you. I'm 13 and my mom is 33. Things at school were never great. I'm sort of short, so I get picked on some, but it was manageable. That was until one of my classmates showed me a picture of my mom naked. I almost had a panic attack and had to be excused from the classroom. I ended up not showing up at school for a few days, faking sick. I'm going to break away here for a second. I was talking about this with Kevin, the producer, before we went on the air here. On the air. No, and then I was going to say on tape, and it's not even that. It's digital recording. I'm a man out of time. I'm an analog boy trapped in a digital world. Kevin said, 13-year-olds don't say the word manageable. And I said, I did. And then he said, quite rightly, yeah, but these are 2021 13-year-olds. I think he may be right. This didn't strike me as excessively sophisticated, but it's probably my own perspective because I was writing at this level or beyond this level at 13, and I know that most kids aren't. So again, don't know if it's true or not. Read you the rest of it. I was hoping that things would cool off, but they didn't. As soon as I got to school, almost everyone in my class was staring and laughing at me. This has been going on for about a week now. I was wondering how my classmates even got the pictures, and apparently my mom advertises her OnlyFans on her personal Twitter account. Some students from my school follow her, so they were able to see the nudes, and they have been spread everywhere. I don't even have a Twitter, so I don't know about any of this. The worst part is when I confronted my mom about this, she told me I was overreacting and that sex work is basically the same as working at a bank or a grocery store. She also said it makes her feel good about herself and that I should be happy that she's more confident now. I told the principal, but they can't suspend thousands of students or take anyone's phones. I've been crying in my room every day for the past week. I don't think I can take it anymore. That's the entirety of the post. You know, in reading the reactions to this on the Reddit forum, there were a lot of people who, you're so stupid to believe that. That's an obvious troll. You guys are so dumb. Anybody can see that that's fake. I don't find this implausible. This sounds exactly like what a mother with borderline personality disorder would do, and the kinds of things that such mothers routinely do. Zero appropriate boundaries on matters of sexuality. Zero appropriate boundaries kept between her and her children. Borderline mothers parentify their children. They make them into caretakers. They make them into confidants. They make them into surrogate spouses. I've described myself that way. I was a surrogate husband for my mother. My mother would tell me intimate details of her sex life with my stepfather, with other men that she brought home. I don't find this unbelievable because I lived it. My mother didn't have an OnlyFans account, but OnlyFans didn't exist back then. This is bog standard behavior for women with borderline personality disorder. Not just this, prostitution, camgirling, which is what OnlyFans is, sexually provocative displays for attention, for money, for love, to shore up your self-esteem. This is classic borderline personality disorder behavior. These are traumatized women. They probably come from traumatized backgrounds in their childhood, very often childhood sexual abuse, and they reenact the trauma and re-traumatize themselves when they get older. You've heard some of the stories about what my mother did to her children in our home. I devoted a 2-part episode to it. If you haven't seen it, go back. It's called Over the Borderline, parts 1 and 2. If you have no trouble believing the things that I told you, and no one yet has told me that they think I'm making it up, I don't think you should find this implausible either. It may be that this is an adult who made it up, but if they did, they certainly hit on all the classic themes. And I'm talking about it because this is the kind of behavior, whether or not this story is true, this kind of thing is going on in households around the country with personality disordered parents and their children. Lack of boundaries, exposure to sexual things and dark sexual things far too early and from the wrong person. This stuff it's always wrong, but it's justified by our culture today in a way that it didn't used to be. Oh, I know. Most of you watching and listening to this, if you actually saw this happening, you'd be horrified. You'd have the reaction that some people on Reddit did. Call Child Protective Services, talk to a trusted adult. For what? What are they going to do? I'm not sure that they'd believe the kid. I'm not sure they'd want to intervene. But this whole thing about this makes me feel better about myself, this is self-actualizing, this is what I need to do. We buy into this logic a lot more than we used to. So behavior that should strike us as abusive and inappropriate, I think passes some of us by because we've been worn down and inured to it. And I included this also because I wanted to talk about a comment that somebody made about our show last week. I shared with you on the show last week a series of tweets in response to an announcement from the American Booksellers Association where they groveled and said they had done violence and terrible things because in their newsletter to their bookseller members of the association, they'd included information about an anti-trans book. And one of the responses was from somebody named Ann Ogborn, who called himself a trans woman and really went off the deep end and said, fire everybody involved, recall all the shipments of books, commit to hiring trans people, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. As I was watching the premiere last week and people were in the chat, thank you very much for being in the chat, a couple of users said, you got fooled, you got trolled. And I might have. I mean, this Ann Ogborn might actually be a troll account. But one thing that irritated me a little bit, viewer, you should have known better. It's on you not to get fooled. Why didn't you see that? Dial it down a little bit. You too have been fooled by these things. I'm capable of being fooled, and I might have been fooled. But the point is, these are not unbelievable actions from people like this. I'm not exceptionally naive. I am prone, like you are, all of you, all humans, we are prone to allowing our biases to sharpen our attention to certain things. And when our biases sharpen our attention that way, yes, we are more vulnerable to confirmation bias, to seeing something that shores up our point of view. I know that happens to me because it happens to all of us. But these things are not out of the ordinary in this crazy time that we're living in. I have seen just exactly that kind of activity from people who are known. Their names, they're known as trans women. They have public personas. People recognize who they are. They're real people, and they say this and they mean it. Satire is getting very difficult to do well these days because genuine real-world people are doing things that you would only have seen in a filthy version of Mad Magazine 20 years ago. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, thanks for joining me. This one's been a little bit long. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And that, folks, is the show. I will see you next week. Make sure to subscribe to Disaffected on your favorite streaming audio platform so you can take us along for the ride. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and almost anywhere else you get your podcasts. Hey listeners, we now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us. And thank you.